This is 18.2, where we're going to talk about the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So this is where we have an interaction between the nervous and the endocrine system. The hypothalamus plays a huge role in regulating the secretions of the anterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, is an extension of the hypothalamus, and that has to do with where it was derived embryologically. Anterior pituitary is going to produce 9 major hormones that play a role in all those functions that we just talked about in the previous video, regulating many of the different body functions, regulating the secretions of other endocrine organs. So we need to understand the structure of the pituitary gland. So pituitary gland is connected to the brain, just inferior to the hypothalamus, and it's going to be connected to the hypothalamus by a little stalk called the infundibulum. It's going to rest within the cella turcica of the sphenoid bone, or the Turkish saddle of the sphenoid bone, and it's about the size of a pea. The pituitary gland is further divided into 2 distinct lobes: the posterior pituitary, which we'll also refer to as the neurohypophysis, and the anterior pituitary, which we'll also refer to as the adenohypophysis. The neurohypophysis naming of the posterior pituitary should leave you a little hint of the embryological origin of the posterior pituitary. So continuing on with the structure of the posterior pituitary, we said that it's continuous with the hypothalamus. It's going to begin as an outgrowth of the hypothalamus during embryological development, and it's composed of nervous tissue. That's why we refer to it as the neurohypophysis. Hormones, called neuropeptides or neurohormones, are what's going to be released from the posterior pituitary. In the image to the right, you can see the embryological development of the posterior pituitary. So you can see up here we have the hypothalamus. And what you'll see is that there's a little bud, neurohypophyseal bud, they call it, that is going to end up forming the posterior pituitary, which is why we call it the neurohypophysis. Now, the anterior pituitary is derived from a different, or has a different embryological origin than the posterior, and it's actually coming from what's known as Rathke's pouch, which is just an epithelium of the upper oral cavity. And what's going to happen is it's going to meet the posterior pituitary, and they're going to join together, separated by what's known as the pars intermedia. Now, talking about the relationship of the pituitary gland to the brain, we're going to start with the hypothalamus. So hypothalamic control of the posterior pituitary is different than anterior pituitary. So hormones produced in the neurons of the hypothalamus are going to be stored in the posterior pituitary. The axons in that region are going to form the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. That is a mouthful. But as long as you remember that the tract is associated with the posterior pituitary, you should be able to differentiate the anterior from the posterior from the anterior fairly easily. But what happens is that action potentials in these neurons are going to cause the actual hormone release. Now, in terms of the hypothalamic control of the anterior pituitary, this is extremely vascular in this region. There's many blood vessels that are going to make up the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. And the reason we call this a portal system is because it is such an intense network of capillary beds. And the anterior pituitary is going to use this to its advantage as a place to secrete those hormones into the bloodstream via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Now, with the anterior pituitary, hypothalamic releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are either going to stimulate or inhibit the anterior pituitary from releasing a specific hormone. So now we're going to talk about some different subdivisions and secretions of the pituitary gland. So looking at secretion of the posterior pituitary hormones. So I want to look at the image to the right. I think the image makes a little bit more sense than just looking at the text here. So what you have is you have stimulatory effects coming from the green arrows and inhibitory effects coming from the red arrows. So we have these hypothalamic neurons, and these are going to be found in the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. So what happens is that we have our cell bodies here, and we have our axons. So what occurs is that if there's a stimulatory effect, what happens is that the neurohormones are going to be created and stored in these axon terminals in the posterior pituitary gland. What happens is when they're stimulated, the neurohormones are then going to be secreted into the blood, and those neurohormones will then travel throughout the bloodstream to reach whatever target tissue they're trying to reach, that they have a specificity for. Now, in terms of inhibitory effects, if there's inhibitory signals coming here, you will not have the release of those neurohormones into the blood. Now, looking at the hypothalamic control of the anterior pituitary, this is quite different in terms of the way that we're getting the hormones out into the actual circulatory system. So I know this image to the left is small, but what's going to happen is that neurons of the hypothalamus are going to produce these different neuropeptides, and it'll secrete them into this continuous, or not continuous, but rather complex capillary bed by the hypothalamus. So when stimuli reach this part of the nervous system, they're going to regulate the secretion of releasing hormones or possibly inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. So what happens is that those releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are going to pass through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system to get to the anterior pituitary. Once those neuropeptides arrive at the anterior pituitary, they are then able to leave the blood and bind to these membrane-bound receptors involved in regulating anterior pituitary hormone secretion. So you have a releasing hormone acting on the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then has the ability to then release or send a hormone out into the circulatory system. So let's look at some of the hormones of the hypothalamus, and these are going to be all of our releasing and or inhibiting hormones. So we have growth hormone, releasing hormone. This is a peptide hormone. Target tissue is going to be the anterior pituitary cells, specifically that secrete growth hormone. And what growth hormone does is it is going to allow increase in growth, increase in growth hormone secretion for these growth hormone releasing hormones, so GHRH. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also known as somatostatin. This is a small peptide hormone. The target tissue is going to be the anterior pituitary cells that secrete the growth hormone. And what this is going to do is this is going to decrease growth hormone secretion into the bloodstream. So if we're at a stage in our development where we need a lot of growth hormone to increase our actual growth, first what has to happen is there has to be a stimulus that will stimulate growth hormone releasing hormone to be released. That will then act on those cells that secrete growth hormone. That growth hormone will then be secreted out into the circulatory system where there will be an increase in growth. Now, if we don't need growth hormone at the moment, we'll secrete somatostatin or growth hormone inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus. That is a small peptide hormone that will act on the anterior pituitary cells for the growth hormone, and that will decrease overall growth hormone secretion. So then we have thyrotropin releasing hormone. This is also a small peptide hormone. This is going to act on the pituitary cells responsible for secreting thyroid stimulating hormone. What's going to happen here is this TRH is going to increase thyroid stimulating hormone secretion. Is going to lead to increased thyroid stimulating hormone secretion. And then we have corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, yet again another peptide hormone. It's going to act on the anterior pituitary cells that are responsible for secreting adrenocorticotropic hormone. And the response that's going to come from this is an increased adrenocorticotropic hormone secretion. We have gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is GnRH. Yet again, another small peptide hormone. This is going to act on the anterior pituitary cells that secrete both luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So that is something to note, that gonadotropin releasing hormone acts on two different cell populations that secrete two different types of hormones. So what happens as a response is that we're going to have an increase in the secretion of luteinizing hormone, which we'll refer to as LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, which we refer to as FSH. Now, dopamine, we also call this prolactin inhibiting hormone. This is an amino acid derivative structure, or has an amino acid derivative structure. Target tissue here is going to be the cells in the anterior pituitary that secrete prolactin. And what's going to happen, since this is an inhibiting hormone, this is going to decrease prolactin secretion. Now, talking about the posterior pituitary hormones, antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, also synonymous with vasopressin. This is one of the two main hormones that we'll see coming from the posterior pituitary. And what it's really doing is it's monitoring the osmoreceptors, which can sense changes in intercellular osmolality. So we're looking at different concentrations of electrolytes and of water, and there's specialized neurons in the hypothalamus that are monitoring these changes. So what happens is if the concentration of electrolytes is increased or if the concentration of water decreases, then antidiuretic hormone secretion is stimulated. So think about why that makes sense for a second. If we have an increase in concentration of electrolytes with the same volume of water, or if we have the same concentration of electrolytes with a decreased volume of water, we are changing our osmolality. The concentration there is changing. So what happens is if we feel that we do not need to be getting rid of water, we need to either dilute a really high concentration of electrolytes, or we have too much or not enough water. What we need to do is then we're going to secrete ADH, and that's going to help us hold on to water. Antidiuretic means holding on to water and not releasing it out as urine. So we also have baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are special receptors that are going to sense changes in pressure. Typically, you'll find these in the atria of the heart, of large veins, carotid arteries. The aortic arch has these, and they really sense changes in blood pressure, hence the baroreceptors, pressure receptors. If blood pressure significantly decreases, then antidiuretic hormone secretion is stimulated. And the thought process is behind that is that if you have a decrease in blood pressure, holding more fluids in the circulatory system should help elevate blood pressure. Then we have oxytocin. Not as dramatic as antidiuretic hormone, but oxytocin is going to help stimulate uterine contractions during labor. Some people will refer to this as the cuddling hormone. Research has been showed that when you embrace a companion of some form for a little period of time, significant release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. So we kind of just went over the control of antidiuretic hormone, and we're going to talk about this more in depth in class when I can blow this image up a little bit. But overall, what you need to be thinking is that antidiuretic hormone is preventing us from releasing excess fluids. And there's a variety of reasons we would want to do that. One is low blood pressure. One is that there's too high of a concentration of solutes. So we either need to dilute that concentration of solutes by keeping more water volume in, or we need to help increase that blood pressure by keeping more water volume within the circulatory system. And where antidiuretic hormone is really working, so if you do want to look at the image a little bit, so you'll see that we have our osmoreceptors and our baroreceptors up here, and we're going to sense either an increased osmolarity or decreased blood pressure, and that's going to stimulate that antidiuretic hormone secretion. So that action potential is going to be generated, causing the release of the ADH secretion into the bloodstream. That ADH is then going to go act on the kidney, and that's going to help us conserve the water that we otherwise would have excreted as urine. Now looking at oxytocin secretion. So we've talked about this a lot. This is our example with the positive feedback loop. So stretching of the uterus and the cervix is going to stimulate more oxytocin to be secreted. So looking at our little image over here, so stretch of the uterus and the cervix, mechanical stimulation of the nipple, any of that can help stimulate oxytocin secretion. So what will happen is that oxytocin will be produced in this hypothalamic neuron. It'll go down the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. This sensory action potential will arrive at the from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary will then secrete oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, and then that has multiple effects here of either stimulating more uterine contractions, which will help with the birthing process. It can also help stimulate the release of milk from the breast to help with breastfeeding. So now talking about the anterior pituitary hormones, many of these anterior pituitary hormones are what is we refer to as tropic hormones. And that just means that one hormone stimulates the secretion of another hormone. That hormone acts on another endocrine organ. So hormones of the anterior pituitary are going to include growth hormone or somatotropin, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, endorphins, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. And the way that I remember this is flat peg. So the F for follicle stimulating hormone, the L for luteinizing hormone, the A for adrenocorticotropic hormone, the T for thyroid stimulating hormone, the P for prolactin, the E for endorphins, and the G for growth hormone or somatotropin. It is extremely important. I will ask you repeatedly which hormones are associated with the anterior pituitary and which hormones are associated with the posterior pituitary. And this is a good way to remember your anterior pituitary hormones. So now we're going to go through each of these hormones, talk about what they do a little bit more in depth. So growth hormone, this is going to stimulate the uptake of amino acids. This is going to help with protein synthesis. Anytime we are growing, we need to be building. So creating proteins from those amino acids. It's going to stimulate the breakdown of fats to be used as energy. It's going to help promote growth and, again, protein synthesis. If we are building, we need the energy to build, whether it's proteins, whatever it is in the body, tissues. We need that energy. So it's going to stimulate the breakdown of fats so that we can then use that energy, which will then, glucose, sugars, whatever you want to call it, to help build our proteins. It's also going to help stimulate the synthesis of glycogen, which is glucose sparing. So it's going to help promote bone and cartilage growth. Obviously, as we're growing, our bones and cartilage is also growing. It's also going to help regulate blood levels of nutrients after a meal and during periods of fasting. And we'll get into that a little bit more later when we talk about glucose and insulin. So continuing on here with growth hormone, we have growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to cause the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. And then in turn, that's going to affect most of the tissues of the body. Now, if we don't want the release of growth hormone, we will stimulate the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone or somatostatin. And that's going to inhibit the secretion of growth hormone. So the direct effects that we're going to look at here is growth hormone is going to bind to the receptors on all cells and cause changes within those cells. Could happen with adipose. And then we're going to see many indirect effects as well. So what could happen is that we're going to see skeletal muscles are going to start producing what's known as somatomedins, cause the liver to do this as well. And this is going to be, or an example of these are insulin-like growth factors. Sometimes you'll come across them as ILGFs. And what these insulin-like growth factors do is going to bind to receptors on these different membranes of target cells. And this is going to help stimulate the growth in the cartilage and in the bone. It's going to help increase synthesis of proteins in skeletal muscle, generally increasing synthesis of proteins to help build, hence we're growing. So here's another little diagram to show how we're to control growth hormone secretion. So what you can see here, it's a little small. Any stimulatory effect where we need to increase the amount of growth hormone, we will have growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus act on the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone will then be secreted out into the capillary beds. Growth hormone will then go act on all the different tissues that we had just talked about, whether it be the adipose tissue, the liver, the bone, the muscle. Once we've released enough growth hormone and we're satisfied, what we can then do is use a negative feedback loop, which will then cause the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone or somatostatin, and that will cease the production of growth hormone. There are many different growth hormone disorders and growing disorders. So chronic hyposecretion of growth hormone in infants and children can lead to pituitary dwarfism. And this is when you're going to be short in stature. Bones are going to have normal shapes, and you're going to have normal intelligence. You're just stunted in growth, if you will. Hyposecretion of the other pituitary hormones have additional disorders that we'll talk about as we go through. So chronic hypersecretion of growth hormone is going to lead to gigantism, which means that you're going to end up being extremely tall. If you have lots of growth hormone, You're going to continue building on the bones, continue building the muscles. You're going to end up being extremely tall, and I'll have an image to show you here in a second to demonstrate that. And then if you have chronic hypersecretion in adults, can lead to what's known as acromegaly. And this is when there's not necessarily a height increase, but you're going to have enlargement of hands and the feet and face bones and chronic hypoglycemia. So what you can see here is you can see an example of gigantism. So during puberty years, things like that, you have hypersecretion of growth hormone, so too much growth hormone being secreted, and that's going to result in an extremely tall individual that you see here in comparison. Now, what you see is that you have chronic hypersecretion post-puberty, and you can notice that this individual has abnormally large feet and hands and very strong facial structures, and that's because you've had a hypersecretion of growth hormone post-puberty. So prolactin. Prolactin has a huge role in milk production. It's going to enhance progesterone secretion by the ovaries. It's going to contribute to regulation of the ion composition of blood, development, growth, behavior, metabolism, and immune function. So it's not necessarily just for milk production. Regulation of secretion of prolactin is going to be from prolactin releasing hormone and prolactin inhibiting hormone, where dopamine will stop the production of prolactin. And how this works is it's going to bind to a membrane-bound receptor, which is linked to a kinase, and that kinase is then going to phosphorylate intracellular proteins that produce a cellular response. If you remember back to chapter 17, we kind of talked about these membrane-bound receptors and these G protein receptors going through this process. So thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as TSH. TSH or thyrotropin, this is a glycoprotein hormone that's going to cause secretion and storage of hormones that we refer to as T3 and T4 within the thyroid gland. So TSH receptors are going to respond through a G protein mechanism that's going to increase cellular CAMP or CAMP levels, and that's going to increase the activity of phospholipase. That's going to open these calcium channels, increasing the calcium concentration in the cells of the thyroid gland. So thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to cause the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. And the negative feedback system is going to work via T3 and T4 and its existence in the circulatory system. An excess of T3 and T4 is going to inhibit the thyrotropin releasing hormone, which then in turn will inhibit the thyroid stimulating hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as ACTH. So we have the CRH from the hypothalamus that's going to cause the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary. And what this is going to do is it's going to cause cortisol secretion from the adrenal cortex. We're going to learn a little bit later, this is a glucocorticoid coming from the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. This is going to be derived from propionmelanocortin or POMC. Environmental stress is a key stimulus for ACTH and an increase in cortisol. And the primary action is going to be the release of cortisol. It's going to help try to regulate stress. And we'll see that this is more of a chronic stress with cortisol rather than acute stress with epinephrine and norepinephrine that we've talked in ANP1 in the autonomic nervous system. So talking about ACTH and related substances, I just want to briefly go over this because I included endorphins into our flat peg mnemonic for the anterior pituitary hormones. But ACTH, MSH, endorphins, and lipotropins, these are all going to be derived from the same precursor molecule when stimulated by CRH. So lipotropins are going to cause adipose cells to catabolize fat. Beta endorphins are an analgesic, and what that means is that it's going to be produced in times of extreme stress and exercise. Beta endorphins, if you're a runner, this is what gives you the so-called runner's high, is the release of endorphins into the bloodstream. Gives you a feeling of euphoria and makes you feel really good. And then MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormones. This is going to cause melanocytes to produce more melanin. And we'll see how This plays a role if you have hyper or hyposecretion of ACTH and changes in color of the skin. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, or LH and FSH, these are what we refer to as gonadotropins. So these are glycoprotein hormones that promote growth and function of the gonads. So both hormones are going to help regulate production of the gametes and reproductive hormones in general. So I'm sure we're relatively familiar that in the case of males, that's testosterone, and in the case of females, that's estrogen and progesterone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to stimulate luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary.